The phone never clicked. That's how it all began. I sat there with the receiver pressed against my ear, waiting for the usual goodbye. But instead I heard my son's voice, calm, certain, as if I didn't even exist anymore. He said, "She has to go to a nursing home." My chest tightened. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. My son, the boy I raised with my own two hands, the one I stayed up nights with when he had fevers, the one I worked double shifts to send to college, he was making plans for my life, as if I were a burden to be tossed aside. And then her voice followed, his wife. Cold, sharp, with laughter tucked behind her words. She said, "Once she's out, we'll sell the house. It's worth at least $1.2 million. We'll take the trip, come back, and it'll all be ours." They thought I didn't hear. They thought I was weak. They thought the years had stolen my strength, my mind, my will. But they were wrong. That moment, that single careless moment when they forgot to hang up the phone, it opened my eyes wider than they had ever been. I sat in silence. Silent while their laughter echoed through the line. Silent while the truth carved into my heart like a knife. Silent but not broken. Because inside that silence something began to take shape. A decision. A promise to myself that I would not be discarded. And I would not allow the life my husband and I built to be stolen by greed. You see, betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the very people you love most. The ones you trust to hold your hand in your final days. That betrayal doesn't cut the skin. It cuts the soul. And when I tell you I stayed silent, it wasn't weakness. No, it was something else entirely. It was the beginning of my plan. A plan they would never see coming. So when you hear me now, understand this. Behind the laughter of my son and his wife was a scheme to erase me, to erase decades of sacrifice, to erase the very home that carried our family's memories. But what they didn't know was that I was listening. And what they could never imagine was what I would do next. Stories like mine happen to so many families. And too often, they stay hidden in shame and silence. If you're listening right now, I'm asking you, stand with me. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share my story. Because no one should ever feel alone when their own family betrays them. When I look back on my life, it feels like a long winding road. Each turn marked by sacrifice, hope, and love. I wasn't born into wealth. Everything I have, everything I built, came from my own hands, from long hours and quiet determination. I married young, to a man who believed in me even when I doubted myself. He wasn't flashy, not the kind of man people turned their heads for when he entered a room, but he was steady, kind, and he worked as hard as I did. Together we built a life brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck, always dreaming of a place we could call ours. The house came first. I still remember the day we signed the papers. The walls smelled of fresh paint. The rooms echoed with emptiness, and yet to me it already felt alive. That house was more than wood and concrete. It was the promise of stability, a nest for our growing family, a safe place where holidays would be celebrated, birthdays remembered, and grief quietly shared. Every corner carried our fingerprints. My husband fixed leaky faucets, planted roses in the backyard, and built a swing for our son. I painted the kitchen walls myself, even when my arms ached, because I wanted the heart of our home to shine bright and warm. Over the years, that house became more than a shelter. It was the keeper of our story. When our son was born, I felt my heart double in size. He was our only child, the light we carried into every conversation, the reason for every sacrifice. I worked long nights, sometimes skipping meals, just so he could have a better chance than I did. My husband and I used to sit at the kitchen table late into the night, counting bills and planning, always with one thought in mind. Our boy must never feel the hunger or the struggle we knew. We sent him to the best schools we could afford. We encouraged his dreams, stood by him when he stumbled, and clapped louder than anyone else when he succeeded. My entire identity became wrapped around being his mother, his protector, his guiding hand. But children grow. They don't stay in the safety of your arms forever. They become men and women with lives of their own, with choices that sometimes sting, with silences that stretch longer than you ever thought possible. When my son met the woman who would become his wife, I tried to open my heart to her. She was beautiful, polished in ways I had never been, always dressed as though the world was watching. At first, I mistook her sharpness for confidence. I told myself she was ambitious, that she wanted the best for her and my son. But slowly, small things began to press on me like tiny thorns you can't pull out. She spoke of money often, more often than kindness. At family dinners, she would glance around our home and make comments about how much it might be worth in today's market. She would praise the neighborhood not for its warmth or safety, but for its property value. She smiled, but her eyes always seemed to linger on things, not people. On the silver frame on the mantel, on the grandfather clock that had been in my husband's family for generations, on the chandelier above the dining table that I saved for years to buy. When she spoke of the future, it was never about children or family, but about vacations, homes by the lake, and numbers in bank accounts. I told myself these were just differences, that every family adjusts to new personalities. But still the unease grew. My son, my sweet boy who once ran into my arms after every scraped knee, began to change as well. At first, it was subtle. His visits grew shorter. Phone calls came less often. He started dressing differently, speaking with a tone that sounded more like hers than his own. Ambition is not a crime. Lord knows I wanted him to be successful. But somewhere along the way, ambition turned into distance. And distance grew into something colder. He stopped asking how I was managing on my own after his father passed. He stopped noticing the little things, the garden I tended every morning, the meals I still cooked in case he came by unannounced, the photographs I kept dusted because I wanted him to feel our family's history was alive whenever he stepped inside. Still, I held on to pride. Pride that I had raised a son who could stand tall in the world. Pride that our sacrifices had not been in vain. And yet, beneath that pride, there was a whisper I tried to ignore. A whisper that said the bond we once had was no longer unbreakable. That someone else now held his loyalty more tightly than his own mother. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself families go through seasons, that love bends but does not break. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the house was still and I sat in my chair by the window, I felt the unease pressing on my chest. I prayed I was wrong. I prayed I would not live long enough to see my son's love turn into something I couldn't recognize. The house in those days became both my comfort and my anchor. Every creak in the floor, every mark on the wall, reminded me of the life I had built, the love I had poured into every detail. It was the last piece of my husband I had left, the one place that felt like his arms were still around me. And though I smiled when my son visited, though I nodded when his wife spoke of investments and real estate, I guarded that house with the fierceness of a mother protecting her child. Because deep down I knew, if they ever set their eyes on this house, they would not see it as my home. They would see it as money. And money has a way of turning even the closest hearts into strangers. Before I go on, let me ask you something. If your own child turned their back on you, who would you lean on? Imagine sitting in your kitchen, holding a letter that proves your family is plotting behind your back. That is why I share my truth here, so no one else feels this pain alone. Please subscribe to this channel, share this story, and help others realize they are not alone in these battles. It was an ordinary morning, the kind of morning that repeats itself in quiet households. The laundry was folded neatly in the basket by my side, the scent of fresh soap rising from the cotton. I set a kettle on the stove, waiting for the whistle, and poured myself a cup of tea the way I always did. 2 spoonfuls of sugar, a small slice of lemon, the warmth spreading through my hands as I held the cup close. Outside, the world was calm, the trees swaying gently, the sunlight breaking through the curtains. It was in those moments that I often thought of my husband, how he would sit across from me with his newspaper, humming without realizing it. That house, even in its stillness, still carried his presence. The phone rang. It startled me, though it shouldn't have. Calls were rare these days, and each one carried its own weight. I wiped my hands on a towel and reached for the receiver. My son's voice filled the line. "Hi, Mom," he said, his tone warm but hurried, like someone squeezing in a duty between more pressing matters. I smiled instinctively, even though he couldn't see me. We talked briefly. He asked how I was, if I'd eaten breakfast, if I'd been keeping up with my doctor's appointments. I answered each question, though I knew he wasn't truly listening. His mind was elsewhere, distracted. I could hear it in the pauses, in the way he shifted the conversation quickly. Still, I cherished it. Even small talk was better than silence. I told him about the garden, about the flowers that had bloomed earlier than expected. I told him about the neighbor's new dog that barked too much, but reminded me of the pets we once had. He chuckled politely, and I felt for a fleeting second the boy he used to be, the boy who once leaned against my shoulder during thunderstorms, whispering that he was scared. But before I could hold on to that memory, he said he had to go. "I'll call you soon, Mom," he added, the words mechanical, a script he repeated without meaning. And then, the sound I expected never came. The click. I stayed with the phone pressed to my ear, waiting for the line to go dead. Instead, voices drifted through, low at first, then clearer. My son's voice, no longer softened for me, spoke plainly. "She has to go to a nursing home. There's no other way." My body froze. The tea in my hand grew cold as my grip tightened on the cup. I told myself I must have misheard, that perhaps he was speaking about someone else. But then came the next words, sharp as a blade. Once she's out, we'll list the house. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it would burst through my chest. Every muscle in my body stiffened, my breath caught in my throat. I pressed the receiver harder against my ear, desperate to catch every word. And then, like salt poured into an open wound, her voice filled the line. My daughter-in-law, the same woman who sat at my table, smiling as she pushed pastries across the plate, speaking of comfort and convenience. She laughed, a sound that cut through me like glass shattering. 1.2 million easy, she said. We'll take the trip, come back rich, and she'll be tucked away. Her laughter swelled, bright and careless, as though my life were nothing more than a financial calculation. In that moment, time stopped. The world around me, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall, the breeze through the curtains, faded into silence. All I could hear was their voices, their laughter, their plans to erase me. My hands trembled, and the cup slipped from my fingers, crashing against the floor, tea seeping into the cracks of the tiles. But I didn't move. I couldn't. My body sat rigid, my mind caught between disbelief and rage. My own son, my flesh and blood, the boy I carried inside me, the boy I nursed, the boy I sacrificed everything for. The man who was supposed to hold my hand when the years grew heavy. And now he spoke of me as though I were an object, a burden, something to be removed so he could claim what was mine. The betrayal was so deep it felt physical, as though my heart had been split in two. I thought of his father, of the pride he carried for our son, and I wondered, if he could hear this conversation from beyond the grave, would he weep or would he turn his face away in shame? The fury rose in me, a fire I hadn't felt in years. My body may have been aging, but my spirit was not weak. I wanted to scream into the phone, to demand how he could speak of me that way, to ask her how she dared laugh at the life I had built with my own hands. But I didn't. I sat there in silence, letting their words echo in my ears, carving themselves into memory. For I knew deep down that silence could be more powerful than any outburst. Silence meant they didn't know I had heard. Silence meant I had time. And time meant I could plan. As their laughter faded and the line finally went dead, I lowered the receiver slowly, carefully, as if any sudden movement would shatter me completely. I stared at the phone, the weight of their betrayal pressing down on my chest. Tears filled my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. They would not have my tears. They would not have my weakness. They believed they had already won. They believed I would be tucked away quietly, out of sight, while they reaped the reward of my life's work. But they were wrong. Very wrong. That day something shifted in me. The shock settled into sorrow. The sorrow hardened into anger, and the anger sharpened into resolve. My silence was no longer the silence of a victim. It was the silence of a woman preparing for battle. I would not confront them. I would not beg or plead for decency. I would wait, I would watch, and I would strike when the moment was right. They had betrayed me in the cruelest way imaginable. And for that, I would make sure they never forgot the price of betrayal. The next morning, I rose before the sun, as I always did. My body moved through the motions, boiling water for coffee, cracking eggs into a skillet, slicing bread for toast, but my mind was elsewhere. Their words from the night before replayed in my head with relentless clarity. Each syllable, each laugh, each careless remark carved into me like a scar. Yet, when the phone rang again later that week and my son's name appeared on the caller ID, I answered with the same steady tone I had always used. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, my voice calm, almost cheerful. Inside I was breaking. But on the outside I gave them nothing. They thought I didn't know. That ignorance wrapped around me like a blanket. And so, I pretended. I asked them about their work, about their weekend plans, about the little details of their lives that they shared so sparingly. I smiled when they visited, placed meals on the table as though nothing had changed, and nodded politely at my daughter-in-law's shallow compliments. To them, I was the same woman they had always known, sweet, compliant, trusting. But inside, every smile was stitched with pain, every word was soaked in bitterness. They had already written me off as gone. I could see it in their eyes, the way they glanced at one another when they thought I wasn't looking, the way their hands lingered over documents I wasn't meant to see, the way they spoke about the future as though I were not part of it. One evening, I stood in the kitchen stirring a pot of soup while they sat in the living room. Their voices drifted through the walls. She laughed, speaking of business trips they planned to take once everything was finalized. He agreed eagerly, his voice tinged with excitement rather than shame. I gripped the spoon tighter, the broth simmering as if mirroring the fury in my chest. How easily they dismissed me. How quickly they planned their lives as though I were already tucked away in some sterile room with white walls and linoleum floors, out of sight, out of mind. But I didn't confront them. No confrontation would have given them power. Confirmation that their careless words had reached me. Instead, I played the part they expected. I asked if they wanted more soup, if the bread was warm enough, if the salt was to their liking. My daughter-in-law nodded absently, her eyes glued to her phone, her hand resting on my son's knee. My son gave me a distracted smile, as though I were nothing more than the help. The woman who had carried him, nurtured him, poured her soul into his future, reduced to a shadow in his own home. The pain was unbearable at times. When I laid my head on the pillow at night, the house felt both full and empty. Full of their laughter, their plans, their voices echoing off the walls, yet empty of the love that had once been its foundation. I would reach across the mattress, my hand brushing against the cold side where my husband once slept. Sometimes I whispered into the dark, "They will not win." The words were shaky at first, fragile, but with each night they grew stronger. They will not win. It became my prayer, my mantra, my vow. I owed it to myself, and I owed it to him. This house was our life's work. This home carried his fingerprints, his dreams, his labor. And I would not allow it to become the spoils of greed. I began to notice the little things more keenly. The way she flipped through glossy travel magazines when she thought no one was watching. The way he lingered too long on calls with realtors. One afternoon, as I dusted the shelves in the living room, I found a folder tucked beneath a stack of mail. Inside were papers, market evaluations, property comparisons, numbers scribbled in the margins. My breath caught in my throat, but I placed everything back exactly as I found it, careful not to betray my discovery. I smiled that evening as I set dinner before them. Even as my stomach churned, they thought I was blind. But I saw everything. And yet, the cruelest part wasn't the papers or the laughter, or even the plans to sell my house. It was the way they treated me in the quiet moments, the moments that revealed how invisible I had become in their eyes. Once while setting the table, I asked about their trip, where they might be going, how long they'd be away. My daughter-in-law glanced up briefly, a smirk curling at the corner of her lips before answering vaguely, "Oh, just business, nothing you'd understand." My son chuckled softly, as though I were a child asking a foolish question. I felt my face flush, my hands tremble, but I said nothing. I laid the plates down, my silence louder than any words could have been. At night, I sat in the living room alone, gazing at the photographs lining the mantel. Pictures of birthdays, graduations, holidays where laughter had once been genuine. My son's smile as a little boy, his arms wrapped tightly around my neck. My husband's proud grin as he held our first set of house keys. My own face, younger but already tired from the weight of responsibility. I traced the frames with my fingers and I whispered again, "They will not win." It was not just about me anymore. It was about preserving the love, the memories, the sacrifices that had built this home brick by brick. To let them take it so easily would have been to erase everything we had fought for. And I refused. So I observed. Quietly. Carefully. I memorized their routines, their plans, their whispers. I pretended not to notice when they left brochures on the counter, when they exchanged glances over my head, when they dismissed my words with polite nods. I endured their indifference, their condescension, their cruelty masked as concern. Each day my silence grew heavier, but so did my resolve. For I knew that the longer I waited, the deeper their arrogance would root. And when the time came, their downfall would be all the more devastating. In those days, grief and determination lived side by side within me. Grief for the son I had lost, not to death but to greed. Grief for the daughter-in-law who had never once seen me as family. Grief for the love that had turned to betrayal. But alongside the grief was a strength I hadn't realized I still carried. A strength my husband had always admired in me, even when I didn't see it myself. I remembered his words whispered to me on nights when money was tight and the future uncertain. "You're stronger than you think." Now more than ever I clung to those words. Strong enough to endure. Strong enough to plan. Strong enough to win, even if it meant doing so in silence. They believed I was powerless. But as I stood at the kitchen sink one evening, watching them laugh together on the couch, I knew the truth. Power is not always loud. Sometimes power is quiet. It waits. It watches. It endures. And when it finally moves, it strikes with precision. I dried my hands, glanced toward the mantel where my husband's picture rested, and whispered once more, steady and unshaken, "They will not win." It began innocently enough, the way betrayal often does. A stack of papers on the kitchen table, my son's hand resting on top of them as though they were unimportant. He smiled at me, that rehearsed smile that no longer reached his eyes. "Mom," he said gently, "we need to update some paperwork for the house. It's nothing serious. Insurance, maintenance, just the usual things to make sure everything is covered. With your age, it's important to have it all in order." He spoke with the tone of someone who thought he was being kind, but beneath it, I heard the condescension, the certainty that I would not question him. I looked at the pages. Long sentences in small print, words blurred by legal jargon, columns of numbers I didn't fully understand. My daughter-in-law chimed in sweetly, her voice dripping with false reassurance. It's just for your protection, Mom. You don't want to be caught without coverage if something goes wrong. Think of it like house insurance. Just sign and you won't have to worry. She placed a pen in my hand before I could respond, her fingers brushing mine lightly, but her grip firm, pressing the weight of the moment into me. I hesitated, staring at the papers, my gut twisting. Something inside me whispered, don't sign. But I was tired of the tension, tired of the charade, tired of pretending I didn't hear what I had heard. So I signed. The ink from the pen flowed smoothly across the paper, my name scrawled in cursive at the bottom of each page. I felt the finality of it, though I didn't yet know the extent of what I had given away. When I lifted my eyes, my son's smile had grown wider, his relief too visible. My daughter-in-law squeezed his hand under the table, their eyes meeting in silent victory. They thought they had fooled me, and in that moment they had. A week later, I began noticing changes. Calls I wasn't meant to overhear. Strangers driving slowly by the house, peering at the yard, the windows, the structure. One afternoon, as I watered the flowers by the porch, a man approached me with a clipboard in his hand. Lovely home, he said, his voice polite but rehearsed. We're conducting market evaluations in the neighborhood. My heart sank. I knew then, without a doubt, that the papers I had signed were not for insurance. They had tricked me. My son, my own son, and the woman he married had transferred the ownership of my home into their names. The house was no longer mine. It was theirs to sell, to profit from, to erase me from completely. When the sign went up in the yard, bold red letters announcing for sale, I stood at the window, my hands pressed against the glass. It felt like a cruel joke. Neighbors stopped by, their faces etched with curiosity and pity, asking me why I was moving. I forced a smile, told them it was time for a change, though inside my chest burned with rage. At night, I heard them whispering in the living room, laughter spilling into the hallways as they calculated what they would do with the money. 1.2 million, she said with glee. Can you imagine? Finally, we'll be able to live the way we deserve. My son's chuckle followed. It's about time. We've been waiting long enough, for me to disappear, for my life's work to become their windfall. The day the house sold, I felt as though the air had been punched from my lungs. Strangers shook hands with my son, papers exchanged, signatures scribbled with ease. I stood in the background, invisible, as though I were a guest in my own life. They didn't look at me, not really. They were too busy with their plans, vacations, investments, luxuries I had never indulged in because my husband and I had chosen security, stability, and sacrifice instead. Their arrogance filled every corner of the room, and I stood there silent, watching it unfold. The movers came soon after. Room by room they emptied the house. My house. Our house. I watched them carry away furniture that had cradled decades of memories. The dining table where we celebrated birthdays and Christmases, scraped and worn from years of use. The armchair where my husband once sat reading the newspaper, his pipe resting on the side table. The bed where we whispered dreams in the dark, where we held each other through storms. Each piece taken felt like a piece of me ripped out, loaded into trucks by men who didn't know and didn't care. I walked through the rooms as they emptied, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The walls, once covered with photographs and laughter, now stood bare and cold. I placed my hand against the doorway of my son's old bedroom, remembering the nights I had tucked him in, kissed his forehead and promised to keep him safe. I lingered in the kitchen where countless meals had been cooked with love, the scent of Sunday dinner still lingering in the air as if refusing to leave. I climbed the stairs slowly, each creak under my feet reminding me of the years we had spent here, the life we had built. By the time I reached the top, tears blurred my vision, but I did not let them fall. Not yet. Not where they could see me. My daughter-in-law flitted through the halls like a queen issuing orders, smiling triumphantly as if the house had always belonged to her. My son followed her lead, laughing at her jokes, nodding at her plans. Neither of them looked back at me as they packed away my life. To them I was already erased. Forgotten. But as I stood in the empty living room, the last box carried out, I whispered to the air, to the memory of my husband, to myself, this is not over. They think they've won, but they don't know I still have one card left to play. If you've ever felt that sting of betrayal, you understand this pain. Don't just listen, stand with me. Hit the like button, leave a comment, and share this story so more people know what betrayal really looks like behind closed doors. Your voice can remind someone else they're not alone. I closed my eyes, breathing deeply, letting the silence settle into me. The house was gone. The rooms were empty. My son had betrayed me, and my daughter-in-law had mocked me. But the story was not finished, because while they laughed, while they celebrated their victory, they had overlooked one thing. And that one thing would change everything. When the last moving truck pulled away and the dust settled in the driveway, I sat alone on the porch steps, my hands folded tightly in my lap. The house was gone, the laughter of strangers echoing faintly in the distance, but inside me something stirred. Not defeat, no, never defeat. Something colder, sharper. Resolve. They believed they had stripped me of everything. They believed my silence meant surrender. But silence, when used wisely, can be the sharpest weapon. And I had no intention of laying down mine. I thought of my husband that night as I lay in the quiet of my bedroom. I remembered the countless times he had called me his anchor, his steady ground, the one who saw through storms without panic. You always know what to do, he once told me when our business faced collapse and I had saved it with a single unshakable decision. Those words returned to me now, threading strength into my veins. I whispered into the dark, "Help me find the way," and I swear, in the silence that followed, I felt his presence steadying me, urging me forward. The very next morning, I picked up the phone and called an old friend, a woman I had once volunteered with at the community center. She wasn't just a friend. She was a lawyer, someone I had trusted for years. When she answered, I told her everything. My voice trembled at first, but then grew stronger as the truth poured out. The phone call I had overheard, the papers I had signed under false pretenses, the sale, the loss, and finally the resolve I carried. She listened without interrupting, her silence heavier than words. When I finished, she spoke firmly, her voice cutting through my fear like a blade. What they've done is fraud and worse, it's elder exploitation. You may have signed, but if you were misled, deceived, coerced, the law is not on their side. It's on yours. Her words lit something in me I hadn't felt in weeks, hope. But more than hope, strategy. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't discarded. I had power still, and I would use it. We met in her office later that week, her desk covered in files and statutes, her eyes scanning documents with fierce precision. "This won't be easy," she warned. "But it's possible. And the first step is securing what they don't yet realize you've protected." She leaned forward, her voice low. "Your finances. Your rights. And your home if we move fast." I nodded, my fingers gripping the edge of the desk. The idea of fighting back, quietly, carefully, stirred life into my veins. I began making preparations. I moved what savings I had into accounts only I could access. I organized documents that proved my husband and I had built this home together, that it was more than an asset, it was a legacy. I gathered letters, receipts, photographs, proof of my life and my rights. Every detail, every scrap of evidence became a weapon in my arsenal. While they planned their trip, their smug faces plastered with visions of beaches and champagne, I planned my war. I called the locksmith quietly, a man who had serviced our house for decades. He arrived discreetly, his toolbox rattling softly as he replaced every lock, every handle, every keyhole. I stood by his side steady while he worked. When he was finished, he handed me the new set of keys. They felt heavy in my palm like the weight of freedom. "Only you have these now," he said with a nod. I slipped them into my pocket, my lips curling into the faintest smile. They would return from their trip expecting access. Instead, they would find a locked door and a truth they could not escape. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. My lawyer friend drafted papers, filing claims, setting legal wheels in motion that my son and his wife would never see coming. Each signature I placed this time was not one of deception, but one of empowerment. With every stroke of ink, I reclaimed pieces of myself they thought they had stolen. And then came the final piece. The note. It was late, the house silent, the moonlight pouring across the desk where I sat with pen and paper. My hand shook as I began, not from fear, but from the weight of what I was about to do. Words are powerful. Words can destroy. Words can reveal. And this note, this simple piece of paper, would be my weapon of truth. I wrote slowly, deliberately, every line laced with the sharpness of betrayal and the strength of revelation. I told them what I knew, what I had heard, what they had done. I told them of the fraud, the lies, the exploitation. And I told them in no uncertain terms that their game was over. That I was not the frail, blind woman they had mistaken me for. That I was their mother, yes, but I was also the keeper of their undoing. As the ink dried, I folded the paper carefully, slipping it into an envelope. I sealed it with my hand pressed firmly against it, whispering, "This will be the end of their laughter." I tucked it away in a drawer, safe and ready. When the time was right, It would be waiting for them. The tension hung heavy in the air as I leaned back in my chair, the faintest crack of dawn breaking across the horizon. They thought I was powerless. They thought I was finished. But the note in my drawer, the locks on my doors, the papers filed quietly in courts they didn't know about, these were the threads of a plan they could never unravel. And so I waited. Calmly. Patiently. Silently. The storm was already gathering, and they didn't even know they were standing in its path. The morning they left was drenched in arrogance. I watched from the window as they rolled their suitcases across the driveway, their laughter ringing like the clinking of glasses at a celebration that wasn't theirs to have. My son spoke loudly into his phone, boasting to whoever was on the other end about finally moving into their own success story. His wife adjusted her sunglasses, tilting her head just so, as though she were already posing for the photographs she planned to take in some distant paradise. They didn't glance back at me, not once. To them, I was already gone, erased, forgotten. Nothing more than a shadow in the background of their brand new lives. Their car engine roared, and soon they were gone. The echo of their laughter trailed faintly until silence returned to the house. But it was not the silence of abandonment. No, it was the silence of power shifting, of the air thick with truth yet to be revealed. I stood still for a moment, feeling it settle around me like a cloak. And then I turned slowly, deliberately, and began my walk through the home they thought they had stolen. The hallway greeted me first. Its walls held photographs of birthdays, anniversaries, and ordinary mornings that had once seemed forgettable, but were now priceless. I traced my fingers across the frames, whispering quietly, "You are not theirs. You belong to the life we built, the love we shared." The living room came next. Its armchairs, though worn, still carried the faint shape of my husband where he used to sit. I pressed my palm against the fabric, closing my eyes. "They thought this was theirs now," I murmured, "but this house only answers to me." In the kitchen, the smell of last night's coffee lingered. I opened the cabinets, each dish and cup reminding me of shared meals, of laughter that was genuine, not poisoned by greed. "Goodbye," I whispered to the shelves, but my voice was not sorrowful. It was firm, resolute. This was not a farewell of defeat. It was a farewell of preparation, of readiness. Every step I took was not about letting go, but about reclaiming. I moved upstairs, my feet steady on the staircase that had carried decades of footsteps, children running, guests laughing, my husband's late-night pacing as he worked through plans. Each creak of the wood was a memory, and each memory was mine. I paused in my bedroom doorway, staring into the quiet space where love had once lived freely. I crossed to the window, pulling the curtains wide. Sunlight spilled in, bold and bright, cutting through the stillness. I let it wash over me as I whispered, "This light is mine. This view is mine. No signature of deception can erase that." Finally, I entered the study, his study. The smell of old paper and ink still lingered, faint but unmistakable. I ran my hand across his desk, my fingers catching on the small grooves he had carved unknowingly with his pen over the years. I sat in his chair, the leather soft but worn, and let the weight of the room ground me. "They thought their signatures sealed my fate," I whispered, my voice steady. "But it is here, in these walls, in these truths, that their undoing has already begun." I rose, walked once more through the halls, and ended in the entryway. The house stood quiet, but it pulsed with something alive, strength, history, defiance. I placed my hand on the front door, the very door they would soon find locked, and I whispered my final promise. "This home does not bend to betrayal. This home does not open to greed. This home belongs to me and me alone." With that, I turned, walking away not as someone who had been robbed, but as someone who had reclaimed the ground beneath her feet. The house was silent, yes, but in that silence it spoke. And I listened, every word a vow that their laughter would not last forever. Days passed in stillness, but for me, they were not days of waiting, they were days of claiming. I knew the moment would come when their car would pull back into the driveway, full of laughter and triumph, convinced their scheme had unfolded perfectly. And when it did, the house, my house, would answer them with silence stronger than any voice I could have raised. It was late afternoon when the sound returned, tires crunching against the gravel, voices carrying before the car had even stopped. I stood at a distance, unseen, my heart steady as a drum. My son's voice was loud, brimming with that familiar arrogance. "When the money clears, we'll finally be free. No more worries, no more sacrifices. Just us." His wife echoed with a laugh that rang sharp and hollow, clutching her designer bag as though it were a crown. Their suitcases rolled behind them, bouncing over the stones, wheels squeaking under the weight of their greed. They were already speaking of renovations, of furniture they would replace, of plans to rent out the house while traveling abroad. They believed their new life was only steps away. But the first step shattered everything. My son pulled his key from his pocket, his hand steady, his mind certain. He slid it into the lock with the ease of ownership. But then resistance. A pause. The key twisted, but the door did not yield. His hand tightened, his jaw clenched. He tried again, harder this time, the metal scraping useless. Confusion flickered across his face. He jiggled the knob, pressed his shoulder to the wood. Nothing. His wife frowned, impatience etched into every line of her face. What's wrong? Open it. Stop playing. But it wasn't a game. Not anymore. He stepped back, trying another key. The sound of the metal slipping into the lock filled the quiet, but once again it refused him. His wife's voice sharpened, irritation shifting toward unease. Why won't it open? What's going on? He muttered something about maybe the lock jamming, but I saw it, the first crack in their certainty. He rattled the handle until the door shook in its frame, his voice rising, his frustration mounting. She snapped. This is ridiculous. We own this place, but ownership forged through deceit has no roots. The house would not open for them. Not now, not ever. And then she saw it. Her eyes darted toward the doorframe, where the sunlight caught the edge of an envelope taped carefully against the wood. She snatched it with quick fingers, tearing it free, her breath coming short. My son leaned closer, the color draining from his face. The envelope was plain, ordinary, except for the weight it carried. His name written in my hand, steady, deliberate, unmistakable. He hesitated for a moment, his thumb pressing against the seal as though it burned. Then with one sharp motion he ripped it open. The paper inside unfolded slowly, the sound deafening in the tense air. I knew their eyes scanned the words I had chosen with precision. Words carved not from anger, but from justice. Words that revealed everything they had dismissed as weakness was, in truth, strength they never understood. I was not locked away in a nursing home. I was not gone, forgotten, erased. I was here, and every step they had taken was already undone. Their silence as they read was heavier than any scream, heavier than any blow. I watched as their faces shifted, from disbelief, to fear, to the dawning realization that their game was over. The suitcase handles slipped from their hands, hitting the ground with a hollow thud. Their plans, their laughter, their triumph, all drained out on that doorstep. And I stood just beyond, unseen, steady as the house itself, knowing that what they held in their hands was more than paper. It was the weight of their betrayal mirrored back to them, undeniable, inescapable. They came back expecting to step into victory, but instead they stood locked out, stripped bare by a truth they could not control. And that was only the beginning. The envelope trembled in my son's hands, though he tried to hide it. He unfolded the paper slowly, as if dragging out those last moments before the truth crashed down upon him. His wife leaned closer, her impatience cracking into sharpness. Read it, she hissed. Read it out loud. And so he did. To my son and his wife. His voice faltered, but he kept going. I know everything. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy as lead. His wife blinked, confusion darting across her face. He swallowed and read on, each line tightening around them like a rope. I heard your call. Every word. The plan to place me in a nursing home, the laughter at selling the house for $1.2 million, the dreams of trips bought with my life's work. You thought I was blind to it all. But I was listening. My daughter-in-law's face twisted, her lips parting in protest, but no words came. My son's eyes darted across the page, faster now, as if racing against the truth unraveling beneath his own voice. This house is not yours. It never was. Every fraudulent document you tricked me into signing has been undone. The law protects against exploitation of the elderly, and I have taken every step necessary to ensure justice. I reversed the transaction using fraud statutes, and the house now sits safely inside a trust you will never touch. The signatures you celebrated mean nothing. The title is mine, and will remain mine, long after you are gone. He stopped, his hand shaking so hard the paper rattled. His wife snatched it, eyes skimming the lines with a frantic hunger, searching for a loophole, a way out. There was none. Still, she read aloud the next words, her voice shrill with disbelief. As for my estate, know this. You are both legally severed from any inheritance. Your names no longer exist in my will. Every cent, every asset, every memory built by my husband and me has been removed from your reach. You chose greed over love. And so you inherit nothing. Her words broke into a scream before she could finish the line. She crushed the paper in her hand, shaking with rage. My son tried to calm her, but his own face had gone pale, the color draining as though the truth had bled him dry. He muttered, "This can't be real." She wouldn't. She couldn't. But deep down he knew. They both knew. I could almost hear the echo of their arrogance collapsing, brick by brick, replace with fear, replace with loss. And then, the last line. The one I wrote with deliberate calm. The one meant to echo louder than all the rest. You locked me out of your hearts, so I have locked you out of this home. Justice doesn't always roar. It whispers. And tonight, it whispers at this doorstep, where you stand with nothing but empty hands. My son's voice cracked as he repeated the line, as though saying it aloud would somehow undo its finality. His wife let out a sound, half scream, half sob, and slammed her hand against the door, furious that it would not open. They shouted my name, their anger spilling into the quiet evening, but the house stood firm, silent, unyielding, just as I had planned. Their rage could not break through walls built on truth. Their greed could not pry open locks sealed by justice. And as I watched them unravel, I felt no need to step forward, no need to confront. The note had done its work. My silence had spoken louder than any argument, louder than any courtroom. They wanted me erased. Instead, it was they who stood erased, shut out, screaming at a door that no longer recognized them. Justice does not always roar. It whispers. And on that doorstep, its whisper became deafening. If you believe every betrayed parent deserves a voice, prove it. Subscribe right now, and share this with someone who needs to see that silence can be the loudest revenge. I did not need to stand on that porch to face them. I did not need to shout, argue, or defend what was already mine. The house itself had spoken for me, and the letter had carried every word I needed to say. Their screams, their fists pounding against the door, their voices cracking with disbelief. It all rolled off the walls like meaningless noise. I watched from a distance, unseen, steady. And in that moment, I understood a truth I had carried my whole life. Sometimes silence is the loudest answer you can give. They stood there for hours, circling the porch, searching for a way in, as if persistence could bend truth to their will. But no door opened. No lock yielded. And when the sun began to sink low, spilling its gold across the house they could not claim, they gathered their suitcases once more, dragging them across the driveway with a fury that sounded like defeat. Their voices faded, and finally the quiet returned. But this time, it was not heavy. It was peace. A peace I had earned. A peace I would keep. Later that night I sat in the living room, the same room where laughter once filled the air, where my husband had told his stories, where my children had played on the rug. I looked around, and though the memories still pressed against me, they no longer hurt. They strengthened me. They reminded me that this house was not just walls and windows. It was the vessel of our life, our sacrifices, our dreams. And now it was safe, protected, sealed away from the hands that tried to tear it apart. I thought of my husband then. I could almost hear his voice, calm and steady, saying, "You did right." I whispered into the quiet. I kept it safe. I kept us safe. And though tears filled my eyes, they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, of resilience, of pride. Because in the end they did not win. I did. Family, it is supposed to be the place you are safest. But sometimes, family is where the deepest betrayal hides. My son chose greed over love, and his wife fueled the fire. That truth will always ache inside me, a wound that never quite closes. But even in that pain, I found strength. Because betrayal does not define me, resilience does. And no matter how deeply blood can wound, it cannot take away the power of standing tall, of protecting what is yours, of choosing peace over chaos. I have no illusions anymore. I know I will grow older, and one day my time will come. But when it does, it will not be in a place chosen by deceit, nor under the control of those who wished me gone. It will be here, in my own home, surrounded by the walls that have witnessed my life, sheltered by the love that built them. That is the independence I fought for. That is the legacy I protected. And that is the promise I kept to the man I loved. In the end, blood may betray you, but strength carries you through. And strength, once claimed, cannot be stolen. I am still here. The house is still mine. The legacy still stands, and I will spend the rest of my days not in bitterness, but in peace. Justice did not roar. It whispered. And that whisper was enough to silence them forever. As I sit here now, looking back on it all, I realize the greatest lesson came not from the betrayal itself, but from what followed. For too long I stayed quiet. Not because I was weak, but because I was watching. And in that silence, I found strength that even I didn't know I carried. Never underestimate a woman who has been silent too long. Sometimes silence is not weakness. It is the sharpest weapon. The house still stands. The locks are still mine. And the note they crumpled in their fists that night still lingers in my memory, not as a paper, not as words, but as proof that truth always finds its way through. I did not need to scream. I did not need to beg. The silence spoke for me. and it was louder than anything they could have imagined. Blood may betray you, but legacy endures. Greed may try to erase you, but strength carves your name deeper. And though they walked away that night with empty hands, I walked forward with peace, with independence, and with my husband's promise still safe within these walls. So remember this: silence is not always surrender. Sometimes silence is survival. Sometimes silence is revenge. And sometimes silence is victory. This was my truth. If you don't want stories like mine to vanish into silence, help me keep them alive. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it. Because sometimes silence is not weakness, it's survival. And with that, the door remains locked, the note lies discarded on the ground, and I step forward into my own tomorrow, strong, unbroken, and free.